As you probably saw from the announcement, I'm going to not have class Tuesday night, so you can probably hear I'm a tad under the weather. I just barely made it through my Monday afternoon class with my voice intact, and even then it's gotten a bit worse. I'm not expecting it to be better for Tuesday night. What I wanted to do was at least go over some of the content so that we don't have to cram too much of what we have this week into next week. What we're going to do is the discussion leader we normally have tonight, we'll do that next week. We actually don't have a discussion leader next week, so that works fine. It doesn't impact anybody else's discussion leader. But I do want to go over some of the content. So what we'll do is focus on Chapter 4, which is responding to conflict. Like I just mentioned, discussion leader 3 is going to be moved to next week, and that's when we'll do that discussion leader for the reading that we've got. If you remember from last week, we talked about this notion of dysfunctional and functional conflict, and I also tied that to different conflict styles. Now, the book calls them cycles and kind of talks about it that way. I buy more into them viewing as styles that you could use to an extent, and they had roughly 5 that fell into either functional or dysfunctional. Dysfunctional tended to include things like avoiding, competing, and accommodating, while functional included things like compromising and collaborating. We also did a little bit of an activity with the PR manager and trying to find hiring somebody for a PR position to help illustrate some of those styles. What we're going to do is really focus on this notion of responding to conflict. The way I really think about this is I would view it as practical suggestions. Now, some of it might sound odd at times, but if you remember from last week or the week before, I put up a slide that basically had the notion that the same ways that we got into conflict won't get them out of us. Put another way, whatever got us into conflict won't get us out of it. We need different ways of thinking at times. I think that's a good way to kind of think about this, and what this chapter does is it really looks at maybe systems or processes that we can use to respond to conflict. The 2 big ones are STLC and the 6-step confrontation process. We'll talk about those. So for STLC, it really does just break down into stop, think, listen, communicate. And you could use this for spot-on conflict. What I mean by that is maybe something that took you by surprise, or when you kind of realize that you're engaged in conflict and need to figure out what to do. So the way to think about this, stop is basically trying to prevent the situation from escalating. That could be even a couple minutes. It could be stop, I need 2 minutes, and then we're going to talk about it, but it could just be stopping the conflict before it spirals out of control to an extent. That doesn't mean you're avoiding it. It just means you're essentially putting a pause on it. That's one way to think about it. Now, the next one is think, is considering what the cause of the conflict outcomes, think about the situation, and essentially make an informed decision about it. I really think it's that notion of stop and think about things. Oftentimes that's just good advice in general, but really thinking about what's the cause of conflict. I'd even say the other person's point of view might help you to understand things better. Listening is really focusing on what the other person is saying, and you can do that by trying to avoid being judgy. In other words, hear them out, and you try to engage in empathic listening. Now, when we say empathic listening, it's kind of almost feeling what they're feeling, but really trying to understand them. That's more than just listening to hear what they're saying. It's really trying to understand them and put yourself in their shoes to an extent. And then communicate is the notion of trying to talk through problems, perhaps using assertive communication, which we'll talk about. I mentioned you could use this on spot, and what I mean that maybe conflict that hasn't been brewing for too long might be good to use on the spot the moment you realize something's getting bad. The stop, think, listen, and communicate approach. So I think it's good practical advice. It might not work in every situation, but this is definitely a good approach to use when dealing with conflict. One of the notions there is that notion of thinking. And I think this is one where you really need to think outside the box. And I hate to use that because it's a cliche phrase, but maybe it's using creative thinking. Maybe it's just thinking different about what the problem is, or maybe even what the solution is. The book has some strategies for doing that, and there are a whole bunch that you could likely find on the internet or even by talking with somebody. But I think that notion of thinking different about the problem is important. The same communication styles that got us into conflict might not be the ones that get it out of it. So sometimes thinking outside the box is likely a good thing. Brainstorming is really coming up with different ideas. So here's a quick example from South Park. It's somewhat like mind mapping or outside of the box thinking. If you think of mind mapping, it's linking different concepts together, going from one to the next to the next. This is just a fun little example from South Park that thinking outside the box to an extent might get you from A to B to C in connections that you might not normally make.
We have to find a way to stop those aliens. Oh, the ship is massive. There's no way to stop it. Wait a minute. Jackets. Oh, no. If people don't wear jackets, they could get cold. A cold is caused by a virus. A computer virus. We can make a computer virus and send it to their ship to disable their computers. That doesn't make any goddamn sense.
Oh, yeah.
The reason that was so quick was to avoid some copyright flags. We mentioned kind of assertive communication, and here's the definition on page 82. The ability to speak up for one's interests, concerns, or rights in a way that does not interfere with the interests or infringes on the rights of others. I think that's an important thing. Oftentimes we might misinterpret assertiveness as something different, but I think this is important. Being able to speak up for yourself without interfering with somebody else's interest or infringing on their rights. And I think that's an important thing. Perhaps this is a skill that can be learned, but assertive communication is important in conflict. I think in particular when you're dealing with perhaps some very personal or salient issues where your interests are something that are important, that need to be taken into account, but so do the other person. So, maybe romantic interpersonal relationships, being assertive could be something important. Here's an example, and in normal class I'd kind of ask what critique do you have of this? Do you think they're right? Do you think they're wrong? But I think this is an interesting way of perhaps how to be assertive. I don't like that it uses wimp. I think some people do struggle with assertiveness. So we'll take a quick look at this. But I don't like that they use wimp. I think sometimes it's difficult to be assertive. It might put you outside of your normal pattern of behavior or what you're comfortable with.
How to be assertive. When you suffer from WIMP syndrome, you're not the only one who hurts. You're actually annoying everyone around you. Don't believe us? Ask your doctor. So stop it. Here's how to stand up for yourself. Step 1. Confront the issue.
Honey, I understand that you get impatient with me when I'm in the bathroom and I'm doing my hair. When you do that, it makes me very angered and flustered. The next time I'm in the bathroom and I'm styling my hair, then maybe you could just wait a few extra minutes for me to finish. Okay?
Step 2. Do's and don'ts.
You are always rushing me out of the bathroom. You're just jealous that I have better hair than you. No, I'd just like to have a few more minutes of peace when I'm doing my hair. I take pride in the way I look, and when my hair looks good, I feel good too.
Step 3. Stay on track.
I'm just so tired of you styling your hair like the Fonz anyway. I just bought that hair gel yesterday and already you've gone through half of it.
So what you're saying is, it's not all the time I spend in the bathroom, but it's the fact that I'm using all of your hair product.
Step 4. Just say no.
You just need to cut all your hair off so this drama can be done.
I will not do such a thing. You want me to cut off my hair because it drives you crazy that it takes me so long to style it? But I won't do that because I'm nothing without my hair. My hair completes me.
Continue honestly expressing your feelings, opinions, and rights, and respecting others while doing it. And you'll be on the way to a happy, healthy, and assertive life.
Now, it's certainly a little campy, but I think they had a couple things that were useful there. I think one of the notions is it's okay to say no to unreasonable requests, but I think the notion of kind of standing up for yourself is something important. Again, I think they could have done a little bit differently, but I think the notion of doing some of those things can help people. So I thought they had some good suggestions there potentially, but even knowing what you want, and sometimes it's okay to say no. And one of the things is, to an extent, knowing yourself. Don't say yes when that's not something that you want. So shifting gears a bit is the six-stage confrontation process. And a lot of the book talks about processes, and this is one that we could potentially use. What we'll do is go through each one, and then we'll kind of, normally we'd talk about these, but I'll kind of go through each of these 6 steps. So first we have prepare, and I think this really falls under problem identification. So what are the problems, what are the needs, what are the issues, and you can do that through self-talk and imagined interaction. What that means, self-talk is kind of verbalizing your inner message, examine aspects of the situation to help you figure out the problem. Imagined interaction, you could think of this like planning. It isn't imagining the whole interaction, which is likely a bad thing to do because you don't know what the other person is going to respond with. But instead it's planning. If they say this, well, I'll say that. And I think that helps you prepare for the conversation. The problem, though, is you only tend to think of your own thoughts and not that of the other person. So I think it is limiting, especially if you take the imagined interaction to an extreme. And it's also, I would say, impossible to fully prepare for every single possible interaction you're going to have. But at the very least, I think it's a good starting point. And that's kind of preparing for the problem, but also identifying what the problem is, what are your needs, the other person's needs, what are the issues you're going to be discussing. Arrange, you could think about almost like arranging when to actually engage in conflict management or conflict resolution. So this is the kind of we need to talk thing, and I'd say be cautious about using that because that phrase does have quite a lot of baggage to it. I mean, nobody wants to hear from maybe their significant other, oh, we need to talk. But you could view arranging as really trying to think about a time and place to have that discussion. Could be setting it up ahead of time. It could be letting the other person know that you'd like to discuss something. And you could, I think, give them a heads up about the topic of conversation. I think we need to talk about X, Y things is different than just we need to talk. When you say we need to talk about these things, it gives the person an idea about what it is. It takes some uncertainty or ambiguity out of the situation. I think those are good things. But just the phrase we need to talk, I'd say, has baggage to it. So step 3 is kind of interpersonal confrontation. And this is where we're engaging in those interactions with other people. And I've got a list there of the things that you would talk about. Problems, needs, issues. I would agree it's good to be assertive here. What I'll do at our next meeting is go through some I statements. One of the examples I have, I'm not able to put up right now, but I'll bring that with me and we can talk about those next week. But this is real where a lot of the interactions are taking place. A lot of the communication skills we talked about in week 1 or 2, when we talked about if you were engaged with conflict with somebody, what would you want to see? We said things like listening, being clear, being open and honest. Well, this is where those things would really come into play. I'd even say things of not being too emotional about things or trying to keep an objective point of view. Those are all things that would come into place here, and this might be where we traditionally see conflict occurring. Now, I think this is an interesting one that out of the 6 steps, they have a specific one for considering the other person's point of view. So this is a really good point to practice empathy. I think it's thinking about how the other person feels and where they're coming from and really understanding their perspective. Sometimes that could be a view that you haven't really thought about, and that might really shift things. So what you could do in this, or one of the tips, is to avoid using I language. So avoid, I know exactly how you feel. In class, I'd usually ask why would that typically be the case, and the answer that I typically get is sometimes it's really difficult to actually know exactly how somebody else is feeling. They might feel that as being dismissive or not being entirely honest. One of the arguments is that it shifts the focus back to you when this really should be focused on the other person and their feelings. So saying, oh, I know just how you feel, shifts it to you when it really is about them. That's one of the perspectives for it. So 5 is trying to move in the right direction, trying to resolve the conflict. At the very least, trying to reach mutual understanding. That's why I have it bolded. Maybe it's understanding what the other person is feeling, what their perspective on the conflict is, and that might help you move towards resolution. This is also an area where you can come up with different solutions. Now, these could be things that solution that you both can live with or might resolve the issue at hand. It could be maybe a couple different ones. You're going to see what works, but this is that brainstorming phase and then where you select specific things. Now, one of the interesting ones that I didn't expect when I was first reading this, when I was initially prepping this, when I first taught 428, but it's that notion of following up on the solution, which I thought was interesting. It's basically saying maybe a month or two down the road, I think the time period is whatever works for the particular issue and people involved, but reassessing the solution, is it actually working? Maybe you need to make a minor course correction, minor tweaks to the solution that will help it work better. But it's answer those questions. Is the solution working for you, and also is it working for that other person? I think those are really important questions to have. They're also difficult ones to ask, but if you can come to a better solution that makes both of you happier, then this is a good step to really hit upon. So these are some things to really avoid when engaging in conflict, as particularly in the 6th step. So I think a lot of these we would typically know about already. You want to avoid being aggressive and accusing the other person of things. In the heat of the moment, that often can be difficult to do, but I think it's something important. So avoiding being aggressive is typically a good thing. We also have the notions of using I statements, which on the whole feel a little awkward, but I think they actually can serve a fairly useful purpose. An I statement is basically made up of a feeling statement, the problematic behavior, the consequences, and the goal. So it would be I, and then what you're feeling, the cause of that, what behavior is causing that, what the consequences are, and what the goals might be. But you do want to avoid being overly judgmental. I think this clip from The Office illustrates those last 2 points. It gives I statements, but it also throws in being too judgmental. So seeing them going from a decent I statement to one that's overly judgmental and not terribly productive.
Okay, so this is the disputed poster. Now, one at a time, I want you to express your feelings using I emotion language and no judging or you statements.
I got this poster for Christmas, and I feel I want to see it every day. It makes me feel like the babies are the true artists, and God has a really cute sense of humor.
Come on, seriously, that? I don't like looking at it. It's creepy and in bad taste, and it's just offensive to me. It makes me think of the horrible, frigid stage mothers who forced the babies into it. It's kitsch. It's the opposite of art. It destroys art. It destroys souls. This is so much more offensive to me than hardcore porno.
So it starts out okay with I statements, but very quickly gets judgmental, and then it turns into destructive conflict. This example I can't show via this recording, so it's something that I'll bring in when we meet again next week. It's another example from The Office, but I think it does a better job of illustrating these I statements, and we'll take a look at that later on. So what I'd say, when I initially ran into this, I thought the statements of I statements could be difficult. Or unnatural. And I thought this quote was really helpful. So the problem is that over time, one's habits eventually seem normal, and any new behaviors seem artificial at first and require effort to learn as new habits. So I think there's kind of hope there. It's this notion that you can learn and improve over time, but just because it seems normal doesn't mean it's actually going to be helpful. I think sometimes any new behavior seems a bit out of place or uncomfortable at first, but sometimes it's learning new habits. So something like I statements sounds a little awkward, like you wouldn't normally use it, but I'd say maybe it's just something that we need to learn over time, and maybe it could be a productive habit for people. What I wanted to do was make sure to give a reminder about the self-analysis paper, which is due on March 1st. This one's worth 50 points, and the goal is really for you to reflect and analyze how you engage in interpersonal conflict. What you should do is take a look back at the assignment sheet. If you don't have a hard copy, it's up on Canvas along with the grading rubric. But I take a look at those things so that you're familiar with what the goals of the paper are, but basically to reflect on and analyze how you engage in conflict. But I think to do that effectively, to write the paper well, you're going to need to go back and look at the assignment sheet. That's up on Canvas for you. The details of this are, it's roughly 6 pages, double-spaced. Definitely an introduction, conclusion paragraphs. And these are the sections I would typically have. So conflict examples, conflict style, strengths and weaknesses, connection, and overall. So let me explain those. Examples are provide examples of how you deal with conflict. And remember, I'm not privy to that, so I need you to explain it fully to me. For style, this could be a relatively brief section. By that, I don't mean 2 sentences. I mean, it should be probably about a paragraph or more. But I'd like you to identify if you fall into one of the styles that we've talked about. I've got them in the image there, or even create your own. But if you were to generalize, where do you typically fall? Maybe you fall into 2 different styles and it depends on the circumstance. That's fine, but you could explain that. The strengths and weaknesses section are where you should assess your strengths and weaknesses, or maybe the good and bad of how you deal with conflict. Try to be objective here. What are the strengths and weaknesses with how you deal with conflict? For the connection section, I want you to connect in at least 3 theories or concepts from the textbook or our course readings. To do that, explicitly identify them, explain them, and connect them. You're going to need to be citing the outside source for this, which would be our textbook or some of the course readings, but connect in some concepts that we've got and explain them. And then overall evaluation, what did you learn? What's your overall evaluation of how you deal with conflict? Again, it's a self-analysis paper, so the idea is that you come out of this with maybe some ideas for how you can improve in how you deal with conflict. But these are the things that should be in the paper. I'm fine if you want to label the sections with examples, style, strength, connection, etc. But these are the sections you should shoot for, and the assignment sheet has more detail for what you could put in each section. But just a reminder that that is coming up. So next week we've got the self-analysis due. We're moving to the Chapter 6, Managing Conflict, the Conflict Climate. The discussion leader that we did have today, we're going to move to next week, but we do still have the self-analysis due. So those are just some quick reminders. I'll pull in some content that I normally would do for today's normal class. I'll pull that in for next week since I'm not able to upload them. But as you can probably tell, it's a bit difficult for me to speak, and I'm expecting the class to, for that not to get better by time we have class. So I think, thank you for your understanding, and that's what we have coming up for next week.